think we're good to go. Sorry for being a few minutes late. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third VAMHN network webinar. Today, we're talking about domestic abuse, mental health, children, young people, and families. And some of you will be really familiar with the work of the network, but for those of you who aren't, then this network is funded along with others by UK Research and Innovation. And we have three kind of aims: to understand, prevent and reduce the impact of domestic and sexual violence on mental health. And it's about trying to build bridges between the work that goes on around domestic abuse and the work that goes on around mental health, and to try and bring those things together. So I am Emma Howarth. I've got a long-standing interest in children and their experience of domestic abuse, and I'm particularly interested in the response to children and families. Today we've got three fantastic speakers, but before I introduce them, then just want to kind of cover a little bit of housekeeping. So this webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be uploaded to the network website. And Julie, our fantastic network coordinator, is going to be live tweeting. And so to join in, I think you've got the hashtag and the tag that we need you to use, but Julie will upload that to the chat. You can't ask questions in person during the webinar, so please use the Q&A box for specific questions to speakers. If you've got kind of other thoughts, observations, information to share, then you use the chat box, okay? So if I move on and just quickly introduce you to each of our three speakers, and then we'll start with our first. So we have Helen Minnis, Professor Helen Minnis from the University of Glasgow, and Helen is going to be talking about the origins of aggressive and controlling behaviour, and what we might be able to do to kind of interrupt the trajectories of aggression from childhood to adulthood. Then we've got Dr. Lisa Hooker from La Trobe University in Melbourne, and Lisa is going to be building on the theme of intervention and responding, and she's going to be particularly talking about some of her work to improve the identification of postnatal mums and their infants who may be experiencing abuse. Then she's going to talk about the impact of abuse on parenting, and then she's going to talk about some exciting early work that she's doing around an intervention to strengthen the relationship between mums and children. And then finally, we're going to move to Concetta Perrott. And Concetta is really going to be talking about the flip side of identification. So what happens when children and families aren't known to services, so they aren't identified, and how we might be able to reach them. So without further ado, I will turn off my camera and I'll hand over to Helen. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Now, this has just told me that for some reason, I'm not allowed to turn on my camera. Here we are. I'm getting a special message. So thank you very much for inviting me. As you can see, I'm in Glasgow, and I'm about to share my screen and we'll get into the presentation. So as Emma said, I'm going to talk about where does the violence start and can we prevent it? So preschoolers are often aggressive, you don't say. We all know that. I think it's a really important place to start, to remember that aggression is not abnormal in the early years. But usually it diminishes with aggression, with development. Sometimes it persists. And if it persists, it often really persists. It can be a lifelong problem and have huge implications for society. So why is this? Well, family conflict is the key. And family conflict in the very early months and years of life is crucial. And this is so important because often I think we imagine as humans that infants are some kind of blank slate, but they really are not. They are absorbing the atmosphere. And a childhood experience of interpersonal violence and or direct abuse, and often those two go together, doubles the risk of actually becoming either a perpetrator or a victim of interpersonal violence. So this is a crucial time to intervene. There's been a lot of talk about callous unemotional traits, and I'm just going to nail my colours to the mast. I really don't like this term. But what we do know is that a childhood experience of interpersonal violence is related to persistent problems with lacking remorsefulness, uncaring behaviours, and an inability to express emotion. And this is what people mean by callous unemotional traits. I'm not going to go into why I dislike that title, but we can maybe discuss it later. Well, part of the reason is that actually witnessing interpersonal violence is not the only important factor. And that's because children temporary research, fields of research in the last 10 years or so is that of differential susceptibility, which has shown us that children actually differ from birth in the degree to which they're susceptible to the environment. So if you think of that little baby lying on the mat with the stressed mum, some babies will be more affected by that than others. And I like to think of temperamental traits in terms of diamonds and gold coins. I mean, both are precious and extremely valuable. But the terms that have been used in the temperament literature, easy temperament and difficult temperament, they're a bit pejorative, but as you'll see, these are not value judgments because it all depends on what happens with the environment. But the reason I use these terms is because diamonds are pretty impervious to what happens to them, whereas gold coins can get kind of tarnished if things are not good enough. But the exciting thing about that is that the diamonds who are not that susceptible to the environment are likely to be fairly okay in any environment. But in a negative environment, the more susceptible children are going to have problems. But the amazing thing is, if they're in a positive environment, then actually they'll do even better than the general population. So it just shows you how important it is to get things right in the early weeks and months of life, because you can make such a difference to the child's trajectory. So let's just look at fearless children. And we know that fearless children in good enough environments actually do really well. They do better than the general environment, than the general population. But if the parenting environment is conflictual and not good enough for the child, then this can lead not only to persistent violence, but also to a greater risk of suicide. So what can we do about this? Well, we know that severe parental stress is associated with abuse of all kinds, including interpersonal violence. It's kind of obvious when you think about it. And when you also think about it, having a fearless child who takes lots of risks is probably going to increase your stress as a parent. Having a child with a neurodevelopmental problem like ADHD, who's hyperactive, likely to run into the road, is going to be even more stressful. That's not to say that abuse is ever the child's fault. And actually, I think as a society, if we haven't supported stressed families enough, maybe we should be blaming ourselves, never the child. So what can we do to avoid interpersonal violence happening and developing across the lifespan? Well, there are some obvious societal things. Understand and address gender-based violence, understand and challenge patriarchy, improve the standing of women and children in society, women and children. I think children are the most oppressed members of society. We need to be thinking about girls' education, equal pay, access to high quality childcare. And this is possible. My mum used to be a social worker in the west of Scotland, and that was at the time when Glasgow had a reputation as being a mean city. When she got married, many of the people in the sewing machine factory that she worked in, many of the women said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." She said, "Why?" And she said, "Because he'll start beating you." So back then in the west of Scotland, interpersonal violence was almost universal within marriage. Thank goodness that's changed. And actually violence in Scotland is currently at its lowest level ever. And my hunch is it's partly because over the last 20 or 30 years there's been an extremely family-friendly government in Scotland. So we can change the trajectories through these societal means. We can also change them through interpersonal means. We must be listening to parents who tell us that they are stressed, and not in a judgmental way, giving them support. We now know that behavioural training, for example, for parents who've got children with ADHD, actually does reduce stress. And we're actually doing a randomised controlled trial at the moment of a parenting programme that's specifically for parents who've got children with a diagnosis of ADHD. And the purpose of that is it's aimed at being non-judgmental and saying any parent with a child with this kind of problem is going to be stressed. And how can we help you? So it's kind of like an advanced driving licence. It's not in any way saying that you're an inadequate parent. It's acknowledging this is tough. So watch this space about that. And I think really just to round up, I want to finish with a positive message. I think of violence, persistent violence, as a public health issue. We can stop it. It is reducing in society. And essentially, we need to be addressing inequalities, and meanwhile, we need to be focusing on the specifics and supporting stressed parents so that less family violence is happening, so that children are growing up in non-violent families. And if you remember those gold coins, some of the children who may have become perpetrators may actually become some of our most positive leaders. That's all I want to say, and I think it's time to open for questions.
Thank you, Helen. So we've got the first question. I'm reading this in real time. So usually in the research or recommendations, we tend to talk about women and children, then investing in girls, but hardly ever investing in boys. Is there any research to suggest investing in boys is not effective? Is there any evidence to suggest investing in girls is more effective?
So I think it depends what you mean by investing. So when I was talking about investing in girls' education, I was being very specific about that. So at a global level, it's been demonstrated that in many low-income countries, it used to be the case that most girls didn't get secondary education. And that has changed. And what's been shown is that that specific gender focus is actually even more beneficial for everyone in terms of gross domestic product. So that's a very specific thing about making sure that girls get the opportunity to invest, to be educated, because they then seem to be able to support the development of the whole society in a differential way. However, I would say that specific child mental health services often invest more in boys, and that's not necessarily a daft thing to do, because actually young male babies' brains do seem to be more vulnerable. They do seem to have a higher prevalence of mental health problems in the early months of years. That said, we're also beginning to realise that girls' neurodevelopmental problems are often missed. So I think that we need to be very alert to this. We do need to have a gender-specific approach, and we need to make sure that neither gender is being ignored.
Brilliant. And the next question is, with regards to violence reduction in Scotland, we are hearing that this was due to the Violence Reduction Unit, but you mentioned this being a family-friendly government. Yeah. What evidence is there for the 30 years of family-friendly government's impact?
Yeah, oh gosh, that's such a good question. We've actually, with colleagues in public health in Scotland, we've actually been trying to devise a routine data study to evidence it formally. I would say that at the moment the evidence is not formal empirical evidence, but John Carnahan, who led the Violence Reduction Unit, used to lead the murder squad in Scotland, and there was what he did was take 6 months sabbatical and came back from the literature with 2 interventions. One was working with teenage gangs, and that was very successful. And the other was a focus on infant mental health. And Scotland has just offered millions of pounds of funding to develop specialist infant mental health services. So there's lots of good evidence that Scotland, the government's been saying for years that Scotland should be the best place to grow up. we've had an early years collective. There's health visitors have all been promoted. There's lots of specific family-friendly things that have happened. Putting it all together and evidencing it is more difficult, but it's pretty convincing at an overall kind of ecological level.
And Helen, I've got a question just following up there, where you mentioned specialist mental health services for children.
Infants.
Infants, okay. So this is something I'm particularly interested in. I guess I'm talking as, CAMHS in England, and that includes infants as well. But to what extent do you think that specialist, infant, child, young people's mental health services are tooled up and confident to be able to identify and respond to children's experiences of particularly domestic abuse?
I think what I would say, I mean, it's interesting that Emma, that you said CAMHS and infant, because actually there just are no mental health services virtually across the UK for under fives. I mean, it's just appalling. And when you look at child mental health services generally, I mean, there's a figure in Scotland, it's just as bad in the rest of the UK, but for every £100 that's paid, that's used for adult mental health, 49 pence is spent on children. So it is so underfunded that it's a firefighting situation where actually most of the mental health support is for teenagers who are already suicidal. So it really is radical that Scotland's decided to have NHS-based services for infants, because all the research shows that that's where you're going to get a bigger bang for your buck for everyone and head problems off at the pass. But we are a million miles from that. And the reason I mentioned casually that I think children and infants particularly are the most oppressed group in society is because I just don't think we value them enough. I think as a society, we should be demanding that infants and children get as much focus in their mental health services as we give to women with breast cancer. We're miles from that.
That's a really good answer, thank you. So I think that is the end of the questions. There are no more questions flashing up. Helen, have you got anything else to add before we move on to Lisa?
No, I'm just very grateful for being given the opportunity to make these lifelong links. So thank you.
Right, so if you stop sharing your video, Helen, and then Lisa, if you can start sharing, and I'll turn my video and microphone off.
Can you see that okay? Hopefully you can.
Yes.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you again for the invitation as well. And thank you, Helen, for that great presentation. It really links in well with what I want to say. And I will be talking a little bit about CAMHS and what's happening in Australia here. So my presentation, I'm trying to fit in too much and I'll probably talk too fast because I've got a lot to say, but I'm talking about identification and responding to women and children in particular experiencing domestic abuse and some of the research that I've done here in Australia. So today I'm going to be discussing probably my research over the past 10 years or so on children and families experiencing domestic violence. My background is a maternal and child health, my clinical background is a maternal and child health nurse, similar to your health visitor there in the UK. And we see families with children from birth to 5 years and are commonly community-based, often sole practitioners, especially in rural areas. And we started domestic violence screening for all postnatal women in about 2009. And that time I was seeing experienced nurses having real trouble with addressing domestic violence work in their clinical practice. They had limited training and they faced other barriers as well. And so I went on to explore screening of domestic violence in maternal and child health with my master's research and then a PhD titled Strengthening Maternal and Child Health Nursing Practice to better support women and children experiencing domestic violence. That PhD involved a randomised controlled trial evaluation of an enhanced systems model of domestic violence screening and supportive care in maternal and child health. And it involved a co-design approach with nurses and with referral services. The model included development of a maternal wellbeing checklist, improved clinical guidelines and pathways, and later health visits instead of the initial 4-week visit. They were 3 to 4 month visits, and there was additional liaison with domestic violence services in the community. And so I just wanted to share with you some of the resources that we developed. So this was what the maternal health and wellbeing checklist looked like. It was a self-completion checklist of for maternal health. That we know that women actually prefer this method, so that nurses did as well. So nurses are attending to the infant while mum is filling this out in the consultation. And mums are with infants, as I said, are asked about domestic violence at 4 weeks, but again, also at 3 to 4 months postnatally, and at other times if it's indicated. And so you can see it starts asking sort of common physical health problems, moving down to sort of breast nipple problems, continence, and then on to more sort of sensitive questions about partner relationship, fear, coercion, control, etc. And so that was a form of identification for family violence or domestic violence in the family. This is a clinical pathway that was developed and used by the intervention. So the clinical pathway encouraged nurses to use the checklist and ask it 3 to 4 months, and then outlined the pathway for the nurses to take depending on whether the woman disclosed or not. And I just wanted to alert you to the principles of good practice at the bottom of this clinical practice guideline. It talks about seeking support, being non-judgmental, maintaining professional boundaries, and being mindful of women's stages of change, whether they're contemplating, whether they're aware that they're in a violent relationship, whether they're contemplating that, whether they're preparing to act on the leaving the relationship, etc. And tailoring the nurse's response to that stage of change. And quickly, just some findings from the survey we sent to all mothers post-intervention. All up, about 14% of postnatal women reported violence in the past 12 months, and around 7% of women were confirmed abuse. This is on the composite abuse scale. And we know that this is possibly an underestimate. And so this prevalence rate equates to about 7 women a week or 1 a day who have experienced probable or confirmed abuse in the past 12 months. And this shocks clinicians sometimes. They just do not realise the prevalence in the community. With regard to screening rates, maternal and child health nurse MOVE teams, or the intervention teams, asked 3 times more women than those in the control group. And looking at the safety planning or referral rates from the government data, the intervention team completed 3 times more safety planning with women than the control, and there was no statistical difference in referral rates between arms. So this change in safety planning rates was actually sustained at 2 years, with a then 4-fold increase in safety planning discussions, which is a proxy for disclosure. So a very successful intervention that was sustained. The MOVE model ensured sustainable screening and improved outcomes for women and children. And I think project success can really be attributed to the action research component of the intervention and partnership with knowledge users, a strong design and extensive use of implementation theory to encourage sustainable change, and collaborative links with local domestic violence services. So this theory-informed intervention led to improved and sustained outcomes in areas such as nurse-client interaction and a 3 to 4-fold increase in safety planning and potentially improved safety for women and children experiencing violence. So if you're interested in that study called the MOVE study, there's a lot of papers out, both primary outcome and process evaluation. So you're most welcome to look at those references there. I do want to move on to another piece of research. So in 2015, we received some funding for the PACS project, Parenting and Abuse Tactics, to explore domestic violence and parenting. It was a mixed methods, insight into the impact and support needs. So the project examined, as I said, the impact of domestic violence on parenting capacity and the mother-child relationship or parent-child relationship in Australia. It had 3 phases. Included a comprehensive evidence review, a quantitative component that examined 3 separate longitudinal studies of children, separated families, and a survey of recently separated parents. And we also interviewed 50 abused women as well. So I'm just focusing on the evidence review, the state of knowledge that it's called. So the evidence explored the state of knowledge on these 4 specific questions. Explored the prevalence of domestic and family violence, which is a term that we often use in Australia, on parenting capacity, what tactics perpetrators use to disrupt the mother-child relationship, how is the impact of parenting affected, or the parenting capacity affected, and what interventions exist to strengthen and support that positive mother-child relationship in particular. So with regard to the scoping review, we saw that the population prevalence was somewhere around 30%, which isn't surprising considering we know that 1 in 3 women experience violence. There was higher prevalence in clinical populations, up to 50%, but that is also consistent with prevalence data. So with regard to question 2, the impact on domestic and family violence on parenting capacity. So evidence shows that women work hard, really hard, to offset the harms of domestic violence and to protect their children. However, abused mothers do have, they are impacted significantly. This is predominantly through their mental health and their ability to react, respond and to parent effectively. We know that attachment is impaired. And abusive partners, most often fathers, we don't really have a lot of information, but what we do know that these men are often authoritarian, under-involved with their parenting, are self-centered and manipulative at times. With regard to tactics, abusive men try to isolate, control and undermine women's mothering, and there is deliberate use of children with messages to children relayed by the father that the mother is unfit to parent and to blame for the abuse, attempts to undermine the mother-child relationship, negative messages such as she's a bad mother, she's crazy, she doesn't love you. These messages shape children's views of their mother to detrimental effect. Interventions range from broad intensive programs to individualised care. Home visiting programs, so whilst home visiting programs for vulnerable mothers have shown to be effective in reducing child maltreatment, improving parenting and children's behavioural outcomes, evidence of their effectiveness to prevent and reduce domestic family violence is limited. So combined therapies has been identified to be best, so dyadic mother and child interventions, and the World Health Organization now recommends all abused children have individual and combined psychotherapy with the mother. So this brings me on to our 2017 Safer Families Centre for Research Excellence with the University of Melbourne and some other colleagues and organisations. And then we received some subsequent funding as well. So to commence the Recover project. So this is reconnecting mothers and children after violence. It's a pilot study of child-parent psychotherapy in Australia. And I should acknowledge my team there, Emma Toon, Professor Kathy Humphreys and Professor Angela Taft. As I said, we know domestic violence is prevalent and harmful and can impair the mother-child relationship. And this often occurs in 3 ways: through the mother, the effects on violence on her physical and emotional health, as I said, negatively impairs her parenting capacity. Children are also affected, especially showing in their behaviour, which makes parenting more challenging. Perpetrators, evidence to show that they may attack the mother-child relationship, undermine the woman's parenting, and use children in the process of coercion and control. And so relational or dyadic interventions like child-parent psychotherapy have been shown to be more effective than individualised treatment to restore mental health and reduce trauma. So CPP, psychotherapeutic interventions based on trauma and attachment theory. Mothers and children attend up to an hour of weekly sessions with qualified therapists. Treatment can be up to 12 months depending on need, but often is somewhere between 20 to 32 weeks. So how does child-parent psychotherapy work? Well, research tells us that mothers keep violence from children and often deny or don't talk to children about abuse. So through structured play, because we're talking about 3 to 4-year-olds here, these are preschool children. Through structured play, a joint trauma narrative is developed, which brings resolution to the traumatic event and strengthens the mother-child relationship, reducing that psychopathology. And so brings that traumatic event to resolution. Mothers also receive support with their parenting and disciplining children, and help for them to understand the child's behaviour and mood as a consequence of the domestic violence and abuse that they've both experienced. So through this mechanism, CPP strengthens the relationship and restores that mother-child health post-trauma. Mums may also have treatment for their mental health as well. So CPP has been trialled in the US extensively, but not in the Australian context. We have limited treatment options in Australia for women and children experiencing violence. So our aim was to assess the feasibility of implementing child-parent psychotherapy into different service organisations. So CAMS, our domestic violence services in both urban and rural areas. We wanted to know, was it feasible, acceptable, what the barriers were to implementing. And although efficacy was not the focus, we were just sort of testing out outcome measures and acceptability of those outcome measures. So we did a mixed method, we're doing a mixed method pre-post pilot study in 10 sites. As I said, aiming to recruit about 30 dyads, although COVID has interrupted this somewhat, and so we're back to recruitment next month, hopefully. What can we conclude? Because I know I'm probably over time. From preliminary data, we can say that child-parent psychotherapy is acceptable and feasible in Australia in certain settings. Less so in CAMS, who don't have specific training or experience with domestic violence, and so need more training and systems support. Although relational interventions for women and children exposed to violence are effective in reducing mental health and trauma symptoms, we do know that more investment in building a domestic violence-informed child mental health workforce is needed, and we need more CPP qualified therapists. We only have about 30 therapists trained in Australia, and almost all of them are on this project. We also need to develop guidance to enable engagement of co-parents, offer treatment when perpetrators are still in the home, which this treatment study wasn't doing, so perpetrators had to be out of the home, and also explore children's experiences in more detail, especially those barriers that prevent young children's access to health services. We have the same problem in Australia with regard to CAMS, who say that they're infant and child focused, but adolescents who are self-harming get priority over younger children and infants. So in recent times also, the COVID impact means we really want to explore delivery of trauma and violence informed care and CPP using telehealth. And for those who are interested, we have our protocol published, and that is it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lisa. That was really, really interesting, and it touches on a lot of the things that I'm thinking about. So I'm going to try hard not to overtake on the questions. So I'm going to start from the top. So there's 2 questions. Sorry, I didn't say people's names previously. So Justin Coleman from the Alliance of Sport and Criminal Justice. So a question is, has there been any studies of female same-sex couples and their children where DV also happens? And this is something that I am currently grappling with in the context of another study.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't make the caveat at the start that I am talking about the violence that occurs between a partner and their partner relationship, a heterosexual relationship. So, and the abuse that is predominantly perpetrated by the male partner and women and children as a victim. But I understand that that's not always the case. And certainly I haven't done any work in that area, but it is desperately needed in same-sex couples and in other minority groups as well. So no, I haven't done any work in that space, but
so
I can.
If you're listening that have, then do upload things to the chat. That would be really interesting to see.
But there's no reason to think that this type of intervention wouldn't be effective with same-sex couples, where the dynamics are similar around the power and control.
Thank you. So a question from Nicola McConnell. I think Nicola has done some stuff around caring dads. So could you say a bit more about why you think the referral rate was slightly lower for the MOVE team? Were there noticeable differences in the referral patterns?
Yeah, so I know that Jean Fedder's done a lot of work with IRIS study, and there's been some great success with referrals in primary care and general practice. In maternal and child health here in Australia and Victoria in particular, there's different referral pathways, and I think we just didn't capture that referral pathway well enough. So we have our universal maternal and child health service, or the health visitor, but we also have an enhanced maternal and child health service, and we believe that a lot of the referrals actually went to the enhanced service rather than the external family violence services, and that's where we didn't capture that. So, but in saying that, we know that women don't necessarily want a referral. So they're not at that stage where they want a referral and want to act, and often want to stay with a trusted clinician that they know rather than going with some external service. So in a lot of ways, health visitors or maternal and child health nurses actually sit and hold that risk.
Great, okay. The next one is child-parent psychotherapy looks good, but what happens with the father, who in this case is the kind of cause of the issue? Yeah, and I'll follow it. There's another follow-on question there as well. Yeah,
that's a good point. It's something we want to expand on. So at the moment, we've got this intervention. We want to assess the feasibility, but what we've really worked out is that, of course, women don't stay out of these relationships often, that the perpetrator hasn't necessarily gone, that he is coming back and forth into the home, into the relationship, and if there's a co-parenting in place, the child is continuing to be exposed to often violence and coercion and control. So at the moment, we don't have existing practices or intervention, CPP intervention with fathers, but it's something that we really would like to do because pragmatically it needs to be done.
And so linked to that is a question from Nikki Stanley, and it's something that I have thought about also, is because in many cases, interventions for parents and children are only suitable once someone has perhaps left the risky situation and the perpetrator is in the home. So Nikki is asking, what interventions do you think are appropriate for parents and children where the perpetrator remains in the household?
I think that's $1 million question, and I don't know of any evidence that actually is, or any interventions that actually are doing that work. So we don't have those safety protocols in place to be able to do good triadic work in the home with perpetrators yet, but I think that's the next that's where the research is going in the future. Absolutely. Thank you for the question.
Just to add, I think there's one paper by the developers of the trauma-focused CBT model, and they've talked about participants in lower middle income countries who are exposed to continuing trauma, not necessarily domestic abuse, and what lessons can be drawn from there. So you know, if anyone's interested, that I think I'll upload the reference to that. And just a final question: are siblings included in the CPP?
So ideally, siblings aren't included. So our criteria, our inclusion criteria, were children 3 to 5, but often they did have siblings, so they were involved in the intervention. But ideally, it's just one child and one parent for most efficacious effects, I guess. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks, Lisa. That was brilliant, and I know I'll want to pick your brains after this. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You turn off your camera. Right. So now it's Concetta Perrott, and she's going to be speaking about off-radar children. So over to you, Concetta.
Thank you very much, Emma. Hello, everybody. Can you see me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Righty-ho. So, having a few technological challenges, as per is normal with COVID. So, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, is that working? Can you all see me and see the screen?
Concetta, I can see you, but I can't see your shared screen.
Okay.
Maybe Lisa, just check that you've finished. You stopped sharing.
I'm gonna click share screen.
Yeah, no, I've stopped sharing.
Okay, hopefully any second now. Right, it doesn't seem to, okay. I think I'm on a, I'm doing a kind of classic COVID office sharing situation where we're having to move around offices between people in the household, and so I've kind of ended up in a room with an old computer. And it's asking me to do loads of updates, and I think this is might be part of the problem. So I'm wondering, Anjali, maybe can you do the share screen for me at your end, and then what we can do is you can pretend this is a Boris briefing, and we can do, I can tell Anjali, can we have the next slide, please?
Sure, Concetta, it looks like you're sharing now. So did you want
I am,
to share?
okay. Right, so therefore I need to get back on the PowerPoint. Okie dokie. I'm really sorry, guys. I'm taking, yeah, you can now see the slide?
Yes, perfect.
Yay. Thank you for bearing with me. I'm now, maybe I'm joining the ranks of all those people who've had children walk in, you know, during TV interviews and all the rest of it. There's going to be a whole catalogue of these by the end of COVID, I'm sure. So thank you for having me. My name's Concetta Perrott. I've got several hats on. I'm a social worker by background, working with children in the care system and in prisons. But I'm now practicing primarily as a psychotherapist with adults, many of whom are coming with kind of trauma backgrounds, including childhood abuse. I'm also a research consultant, and I am the co-founder of Survivors Voices, which is a peer-led grassroots organisation that seeks to harness the wisdom and experience of people with direct experience of abuse in order to create a change in the way our systems and frontline practice responds to abuse and trauma. So that's my background. And I'm a survivor of abuse. Maybe that's implicit in my being a founder of Survivors Voices, but I like to kind of be sort of quite upfront about the fact that I wear that hat as well. I experienced multiple forms of abuse as a child and teenager in an honour-based context, and I was unknown to services until the age of 16 and a half, when I first contacted Childline, who were amazing and supported me through various attempts at running away until I managed to finally stay away. So I've got kind of experiences on many sides of the couch, if you like. And what happened for me, which is the starting point of this piece of work, is that I had this experience when lockdown happened. And that was, I really began, my daily life is fairly grounded, I would say. I'm on a healing journey, as many of us are, probably for the rest of my life. But I experienced a real reliving of the terror of entrapment. The things that were going through my head when March lockdown happened was, I would not have survived if that were me. To have school taken away from me. School was absolutely my safe place. And it was a very visceral, somatic reliving of the terror. And I've since found out that that was the experience for quite a lot of adults, survivors, that we were flung back into that entrapment. So I decided in good old survivor mission style, which those of you familiar with Judith Herman's work will know that she talks about third stage of recovery, often involving a sense of survivor mission, doing something with the experiences you've had, or as we say in Survivors' Voices, turning the shit into gold. So I approached Sian from the VAMHN network, who's also colleague and friend, through KCL, and said, that this is a thing that's happening here, and what can we do? And so through that initial conversation, I went ahead and initiated and pulled together other survivors to do a very rapid survey, which we turned around in 3 days and had 49 responses, 39 of which were adults with direct experience. So what we were seeking to do was go to people who know what it's like to be trapped at home, being abused, but nobody knows about it. And it's like, from our experience, what wisdom can we mine to tell the world these are the certain actions that maybe would be needed urgently to address this. And we produced an interim report in April. So as you can see, we did this piece of work really quickly. And the report contained a range of things that obviously were untested, but were sort of like a condensing of the wisdom of people with lived experience. It had a whole section around communication, ideas of how to reach off radar children and young people, ideas around national campaigns, methods of communication, and the content of that communication. Then there was a whole load of ideas for urgent actions that people felt should be taken by various sections of services. Schools were very central to this. Statutory services, obviously safeguarding, children's services, police, health, and others, but also stuff around inter-government and interagency actions, and very significantly, this is what communities need to be doing. And then that included some really interesting things like, people who are naturally still going to the front door of people's houses, so delivery people, should be kind of made more aware. And I noticed not long after that the NSPCC have done a partnership with Deliveroo. So, it's really interesting that these kind of wisdoms are kind of coming from more than one direction. And what happened with that report was that via our membership of the Survivors Trust, who meet regularly with the government's Silver Command, that report was put in the hands directly of the Silver Command group, and they were made aware that the lockdown was going to be having this probably pretty horrific hidden impact on children who were off the radar to anybody, who had suddenly had the safety of the school, not just school, but also youth clubs, scout groups, sports groups, taken away. And I'm told by the feedback that I had from that this report in part led to the Boris's Hidden Harm Summit that happened, I think, in early May. So what we decided to do, again with support from VAMHN and King's College London, we put in some further bids to try and deepen and enrich the understanding that had come from that first report. So we did a second survey inquiring further about the kind of suggested actions that had been recommended by people in the first one, so asking people to rank which ones were most important, but also we had quite a lot of free text space for people to add extra ideas and thoughts and also expand around the ideas that came up. And we've produced a draft report on this with themes, and what's happening is that we're now going to be doing some roundtable discussions with survivors, with professionals, and survivor professionals, and people with skills in communications, including young people, to look about how we can actually apply some of these ideas or make recommendations for policy and practice changes. So the second survey, we had 71 respondents, of which 58% were adults with lived experience and 6% young people with lived experience, and most of the rest were people who have a lot of wisdom coming from being allies, either as friends or family, supporters or professionals. The findings of the second survey really honed in on the ideas around what can we do to recognise abuse, and how do we respond to disclosures, and then how do we support people who have disclosed. And fourthly, and really importantly, a recognition, I think, from many of our lived experiences that for many of us it can often be almost impossible to tell, which I'm going to touch on in a moment, and that when you have, there's always going to be probably quite a large section of children and young people who, whilst they are still living at home, will not be able to tell. What messages of hope could be given to help sustain people whilst the abuse is still only known to them? And how do we support the possibility of them being able to kind of move closer towards getting some support directly or indirectly? So this was the ranking exercise, where we gave a whole list of the suggestions that had been made previously in the first report and asked people to say which ones are the most urgent. And you can see here that there were some clear things that came out around educating children and young people to know what abuse is for themselves, which again I'm going to touch on, and looking at teachers having check-ins with children and young people during lockdown or social restricted times, and that should be somebody who's got a connection with a child as far as possible. There were issues around, the second box around statutory services is obviously the first line here is, I think, huge and fundamental, that services and organisations such as children's services, CAMS, the police receive sufficient resourcing to actually respond to the degree of demand that is out there, and that there is something there that touches on very huge systemic issues that I'm sure many of us are aware of. And there was a whole area that came out of really important around a communication strategy that is like a public information campaign that's needed. And lastly, that communities and families were central to this, that we need to kind of educate communities. So I'm going to expand very quickly on some of the themes that these touch on and that were picked up in the free text as well. And the thematic analysis of the free text was a very profound experience. Actually, I was one of the researchers that did that, and there were two other survivor researchers. There was a lot of data and experience that was shared, and it was very profound, kind of trying to sort of get the themes out of that. It was very touching and actually quite a difficult thing to do. But I'm just going to pick on three of the themes that came out because of time limits. So the first one is going to be no surprise to people, but it's important again that this is what people with direct experience are saying, that it's often impossibly hard for people who are being abused at home to reach out for help and tell. And there's many reasons for that were given. Trauma bonding is one of them. The people that you're telling on are people that you love, that you don't want to get into trouble. Secondly, that they're often, for many of us, this is our normal, and so there's a lack of recognition that what's happening is actually even abuse or is not right. There is that kind of the phenomena that often we have had secrecy internalized into us, that we shouldn't tell, and also threats if we do. Then interestingly, when this is kind of going, people were talking about how, particularly in the school setting, their behaviour was mislabeled as just them being difficult children, rather than seeing the behaviour as a trauma communication. And the converse of that was that there was quite a strong theme amongst the responses about that there's a stereotype of abused children as troubled children, but this hides a whole group of children and young people who are model children. And I was one of those. I mean, I was absolutely the perfect pupil. And that sense of kind of perfectionism is often actually a trauma response, you know, I realise now. So that was kind of highlighted as, please don't assume that the kind of the really good children are not okay. Then there was the barrier around where people had tried to tell directly or indirectly, and it was either dismissed or shut down or poorly responded to. And then there were huge, you know, there's huge issues around the resourcing of statutory services, and that the responses often are inadequate because the services don't have enough time or staff, which, you know, we all know are common issues. So that came out as a very strong theme. The other two that I'm going to give you some quotes actually, but hopefully I've got time to illustrate this, but the other two themes I want to highlight are more of the solutions that people were suggesting. So I don't know, I'm going to read them out. It's probably easier than having periods of silence, but here somebody was saying, I was dying for someone to openly ask me about this, as I did not have the words to describe what was happening to me. Looking back, if a teacher, doctor or friend of the family asked me directly if I felt safe at home, it would have been an opportunity to say no without having to find the courage or the words that as a 10-year-old I lacked. To encourage disclosure, honesty is key. Telling children that it is safe and okay to talk about what is happening and it will all be okay will not help. Children who are being abused will be conditioned not to tell people, which may well include threats of what will happen if they do. In situations where it is someone very close to them doing the abusing, then they will not trust a stranger who suddenly tells them something different. In addition, children will know that talking about the abuse risks bringing change, and not being upfront about that won't help. Obviously, lots of very challenging issues just in that paragraph. So the other strong theme was that education to help recognition of abuse was really critical. And this, for those of you that are aware of the VAMHN Research Priorities consultation that we did with Survivors' Voices and VAMHN last year, this was a piece of research that was conducted with, again, directly to mine the experience of survivors. It was another one of the central findings. And here what we're talking about is that the need to raise awareness of what abuse is without necessarily using the words violence and abuse often, so that people can see that what's happening to them is not normal. And this thematic analysis very strongly kind of showed that, or indicated that this education was needed for children and young people, but also for professionals and for communities, so that we can increase our ability to recognise abuse for oneself if one is experiencing it, but also by professionals and communities, and how do we respond, what are the signs. And it was felt that school-based education was a really kind of normal place to do it, but also that social media and using influences and also communicating in clever ways through, you know, posters and things like that in normal places that children and young people would go. And this touched very much on a very strong theme in both the surveys, that we needed a national public information campaign funded to really help bring these issues to the fore. And I know there's been some attempts of that in lockdown, particularly around domestic violence. Again, here's some of the direct quotes. In my experience, having one consistent, oh, sorry, wrong one, no. In my case, it was not until I got to university that I discovered other people's fathers don't hit them. I had always assumed that this happened to everyone. Educate all children about safe and unsafe experiences at home, so they can recognise what is acceptable and unacceptable living situations, and make them aware of services available for them to access. Lastly, we need to make sure that every single adult knows what child abuse is and what the signs are, so that if you need to, you can disclose to your neighbour or your local shopkeeper and they would know what to do. And lastly, probably the most common phrase that came up in the reams of free text in the survey was safe places, safe places, safe places. And there was this feeling that there is a need to intentionally, I underline the word intentionally, create safe places and trustworthy people, be that in schools, in mental health services, in health services, in support services, where it increased the possibility of the issue being raised, and I know that someone's already mentioned the IRIS programme, and there's a parallel there, but also that the response would be an appropriate response. And the idea of ambassadors in the community was raised, which is an interesting one, you know, compared to dementia friends, about, you know, this particularly for pandemic restriction times, where there was a real sense of fear around people not having any contact with anybody and being very trapped and stuck. And also that teachers should check in with pupils during any lockdown times, so that, you know, and there should be a teacher who has a rapport, so that again increases the chance of somebody being able to say things are really not okay. And another very strong thing that came through again and again was about the quality of our listening. And that this should be backed up with training for professionals in how to actually respond if somebody is indicating, and often that the disclosures are not overt, they begin as subtle ones. Can
you wrap up so we can just get a few questions?
Yeah. I've got one more quote and then I'm done. So, in my experience, having one consistent, trustworthy adult was key. This can be anyone. Surround the community with a positive set of invisible, proactive people. Provide more community-based drop-in centres for children to access as a safe place. And then listen, listen, listen. I was in so much pain, I needed someone to listen to me. And I just want to read one more quick because I thought it was really helpful. Which I can't find right now. Where is it gone? Yeah, someone really seeing you as a person and a human being and validating your experience is the most powerful thing that services, organisations and communities can do to help off-radar children experiencing abuse, whether that leads to disclosure or not. So we're doing a few things to take this further, which I'm happy to explain in the questions. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. So there have been a couple of people just saying this is really interesting and important work. So Helen, one of the panelists, wanted to ask, how can we encourage the media to report as much about the current experiences of children as they do about IPV effects on adults or the pain of adult survivors? I think the pandemic has really shown the way we adults fail to imagine the experience of children. Yeah,
I think that's true. And I think for me, it's often very frustrating that when people talk about domestic violence, generally, but also I think in services, there is this feeling like domestic violence is about adults and then children are the bystanders. And I know that we've been making kind of headway on that. And the media does talk much more about children as victims of domestic violence, even if they are just observing. But it's going in the right direction, but I still think it's a long way to go. And, I feel that really, profoundly at times where I'm listening to a program on the radio. And I've started using the phrase that I am a survivor of childhood domestic violence, so that people understand there is this other category of domestic violence that isn't just about adults fighting and children being caught up in the crossfire. I don't think that necessarily answers the question, but I think there is something around changing our language, and that came through quite strongly in the survey, that sometimes even using words like violence and abuse isn't the kind of language that children would use. They would say scary things are happening at home, or mummy and daddy are shouting all the time, or I don't feel safe, or it's those kind of languages that are more descriptive rather than the categories that we're so used to in our professional sort of lives.
Perhaps, you know, taking the kind of outputs of the report forward, I was just struck, so you're going to do some round tables in the next couple of months, and I wondered, I mean, there are a lot of people here that will be interested in hearing about that, or potentially interested in being involved. Is there opportunity to be involved in this, and how would people let you know?
So if people are interested, perhaps they can email the same email that they signed up to the seminar to, because it's the same, you know, we're working in the same team. So yeah, we're doing 3 roundtables. One is for survivors, one is for professionals, including survivor professionals, because, you know, I very strongly kind of feel and always say when I do talks like this is that many of us have got 2 hats on. Sometimes we just don't say it because it may not feel okay to do so. And then the third one is actually looking at communications, because it's such a strong theme from these 2 pieces of work that actually we need to get messages out there at lots of levels, including a national campaign, if that would be something that we could really urge government to do. But that we want to actually harness young people and communication experts in how do we create those messages. So yeah, please, if people want to participate, that would be great too.
Maybe the recognition of children as victims in their own right in the domestic violence bill will be a kind of real platform to take the findings forward. Brilliant. Okay, can I ask some questions that are outstanding on the Q&A forum? But can I ask all of the presenters now, the panelists, to put their cameras on? So if people start thinking about the big questions that they want the kind of input across the panelists from, but I was going to start off with a big question. Obviously, I'm a researcher, and sometimes I can be guilty of coming at this from, you know, we need to do more research. What research do we need to do? But I'll counter this with a practice-focused question as well. But I was just interested to hear people's thoughts about, in the next 5 years, you know, we've got a patchy evidence base. Where do we need to focus our attentions to be able to accumulate lots of evidence in a couple of areas so that we can really direct or inform practice from a strong position of evidence? That's to all of you.
I'm happy to jump in. I think there's an absolutely massive gap the size of the Grand Canyon in infant research. So there's been a big boost in funding for child and adolescent mental health research, but actually it's all focused on 14 plus. And from, I think, all that we've been saying, we need to be thinking about the experience of babies and young children, really understanding that there is such a gap. So we pitch from.
Yeah, it's interesting that it carries across to Australia as well, and similar systems issues and lack of young children and infants being able to access these sort of services that are needed, and also that we need to develop these interventions for these younger age group as well. But there is perinatal child parent psychotherapy as well. So for women who've had abuse or trauma in their life and have identified issues around attachment with their unborn child, to have child parent psychotherapy. I think that's really something that could be further explored, certainly from our perspective here in Australia too.
Just from the piece of work that we're doing currently, one of the things that's come up as a future thing is the need, you know, around the theme of communications, is to develop communication tools that denormalize violence and abuse, if you like, for little children. So often a lot of communications, you know, when people talk about, you know, education materials in schools, we're talking about secondary schools and teenagers, but there's been a strong feeling of the need to develop and try out and test maybe sort of storybooks that talk about what feels okay and not okay in a house. Again, trying not to use violence and abuse. I'm aware of the work of Dr. Karen Treisman, you know, doing that with regards to trauma for little children, but that's something that's come up as a gap.
Brilliant, thank you. And then, so thinking about practice, obviously, you know, people still need to be able to offer an adequate and safe response to people while evidence accumulates. And it's a kind of misnomer to think that you can always have an evidence-informed response if the evidence base is so patchy. So in the next, 5 years, where should we focus kind of the response in terms of strengthening the response and polishing the response that we already have?
I'll jump in again. I think one of the things we're doing a randomised controlled trial of an infant mental health intervention for children who've experienced abuse and neglect in the preschool period. And I think if there's one of the things that I've really learned through that is the importance of working in partnership. And actually we've formed an amazing partnership between health and social care colleagues around the trial. And it's just reaped benefits, because what I notice as a child and adolescent clinician is a constant argument. This is social, this is mental health, this is social, and it's always both. So if we can just get around the families that are struggling most and that are most challenged, we could prevent so much harm.
I wonder, and this is touching on areas that in many ways are kind of way beyond my expertise, but anecdotally, as a social worker in yesteryear, and my husband works in that field still now, so I kind of have a feeling of what is currently going on. I feel there is something around the economics of how as a society we respond to household violence and abuse, in the resourcing of social work teams, the resourcing of CAMS teams. And I know this is the obvious thing to say, and it's quite a depressing kind of line to go down, but as long as these teams are on their knees, struggling, then practice, you can set as many kind of standards for good practice and train as much as you like. But if you've got stressed teachers, social workers, healthcare workers, it's going to impact on the ability to be trauma informed and do that deep listening that was so strongly coming out in our report. So there is something for me around, does there need to be a partnership with people who've got really good economic heads to do the kind of cost benefit analysis around investing extensively in our response to this issue in society. It is probably one of the biggest issues. It impacts every form of mental health and social well-being kind of indicators. And if the pandemic has shown us anything, is that we can find money to do stuff. And this is the big issue that's not going to go away until we resource it properly.
Can I ask, sometimes I'm on this soapbox, and that there are a couple of questions that I'll bring in, but do you think that there's a difference in the way that children's experience of domestic abuse is positioned against other adversities? My sense is that sometimes when you have a list of the adversities, domestic abuse, for whatever reason, falls to the bottom. Just interested to hear people's thoughts on that.
I'm probably not the best person to respond to that one either, but I think it's got something to do with this misinformed idea that children are just witnessing and not actually experiencing the domestic violence, and so aren't being affected, and that's just not the case. So we know that very young children, infants under 6 months, are affected by the violence that occurs in the home, and how that it affects the mother and subsequently the child. So I think that it's just not a visible sort of thing. Yeah.
It's back to that failure of imagination. My mum was a social worker actually, and one of the things she used to continuously say to me is, as adults, it's much harder for us to remember what it was like to be a child and to identify with children. If you're sitting in a child protection conference, you see it. Once you think that way, you notice everyone thinking about the experience of the parents and the experience of the social workers, and actually failing to remember that if this is bad for the adults, what must it be like for a child who's trying to make sense of everything? And I just feel that's something we just need to continually remind ourselves of.
And I guess that feeds in, Concetta, into your kind of aspiration about developing this like really strong communications plan about emphasizing the child's perspective and what it's like?
Yeah, you know, that's quite a difficult thing, isn't it? Because when, you know, I don't know about you, but when in the past there's been adverts on TV, you know, they can be both shocking, and you sort of think, well, we do need to shock, and they're very triggering if you're a survivor, if suddenly this advert pops up on TV that's about addressing abuse. But there's got to be a coming together, because our world is so glued together now by instant communication. We've got to be able to harness this to help us with this big social issue. So yes, I think the communication aspect is a key that it's going to need a lot of kind of good heads coming together to harness social media for good, really. Yeah.
And just another question.
Oh, sorry, Emma, I was just going to jump in and say, I'm not sure what's happening over in the UK around primary prevention of domestic violence and abuse. We're doing a lot of work around sort of respectful relationships in secondary schools, and some work in tertiary schools, but tertiary settings, but not primary prevention in those early years to stop violence before it occurs, to stop the sexual violence that's happening to young children in the home, and the subsequent abuse that increases the risk for the child to be a perpetrator or a victim in the future. So investing in primary prevention, I think there's a lot more work to be done there. Sorry to cut you off.
Not at all. And actually it feeds really nicely into the question that I was going to ask. So hold on, it's Anjuli. Wait, oh no, it's not Anjuli. Sorry, I've just clicked off the questions. So Natalie Quinn Walker has asked on the kind of topic of schools, do you think teachers have been kind of equipped with the skills and training to support children? And I guess that is both in kind of delivering curriculum, which there is an expectation around what a healthy relationship is, and what the impacts of abuse specifically might be, but also in identifying and supporting children as they come to the fore in that school setting. Because there's increasingly, particularly with the green paper around children's mental health in schools, there's increasing pressure on schools and teachers to be able to respond to all of the issues that may be disclosed to them. So yeah, your thoughts on that would be good.
I'm not an educationalist, and I'm not, you know, so I don't know the kind of details, but I'm a mum and I've got 2 children who've been through lockdown, and it's been very interesting to see, really, you know, they're both in really nice schools, but the capacity for the teachers to be able to do that kind of communication that was really needed to catch people who are at risk, I think was almost non-existent. I think the teachers, lot is a totally overburdened one. I have clients who are teachers as well, and I do think that the thing that lockdown and this piece of research has highlighted so strongly to me is how central schools are, not just for education. They are absolutely central to catching where things are really going wrong. And I think teachers in many ways are kind of being asked to be social workers, and I'm not sure that they have been given the training, and even if they have, I don't think they've got the time. So again, it comes back down to resourcing.
I would just add that I thought your point earlier, Conchetta, about the kind of good children who are experiencing abuse and neglect is really important. So a lot of work that we've done is about reactive attachment disorder, which basically is characterised by a failure to seek and accept comfort. And so that's a direct, I mean, it's only ever described when children are experiencing really frightening environments. And what happens is kids just close down and they don't ask for help. And I think, you know, that really hasn't been discussed much in the education setting, but a lot of those kids are really going to go under the radar. And I think teachers need support, and it's not, again, it's back to that partnership. They shouldn't be expected to be social workers, but they should have communication channels with social workers and health professionals, and be given the education to help to know who to refer and when.
My experience as somebody with lived, you know, from having been abused in the home, it dates back some time, and that my heart's hope is that things have changed. But I went to school with black eyes and nobody said anything. So I'm really hoping that things have changed.
I think that's such an important point. It's so awful to hear that, but it does not surprise me. And I think it's also a biological thing. The reciprocal parenting, the adult reciprocal thing that goes with attachment behaviour. Children reach out for help, and adults, we're supposed to shut it down. We're programmed biologically to shush children and soothe them. And I think that makes us absolutely blind to children's pain. So that somehow we need to support people in actually seeing what's right in front of them. That's
a very powerful point.
I'm interested to hear thoughts, and we've got a couple more minutes. So there's lots of chat and talk and research about trauma-informed practice. To what extent is trauma-informed practice domestic abuse informed, and what kind of extensions might be needed, if any?
I think that's one for Helen.
Gosh, I felt I'd said loads already. Trauma-informed, I think, needs to be really looking very carefully. And one of the things we've noticed is in our research is that a lot of children who have experienced trauma also have neurodevelopmental problems like ADHD, autism, tic disorders, learning disabilities, and we mustn't forget that. So my answer to that would be, if you're going to be trauma informed, just really, really have your eye open and make sure that you have that partnership approach and make sure you really understand, turn over all of the stones, I guess. I don't know if that answers it, but.
I think I'm just pressing in the sense of if you are equipped as a trauma-informed practitioner, is there anything additional that people might need to make them competent to respond to domestic abuse, or does trauma-informed kind of, encompass it all?
One of the things I've often said, kind of coming from my experience professionally as a social worker, but also personally, is that there needs to be something not just about what is trauma, and we've got all the different categories of trauma, and you've got primary trauma, secondary trauma, and one incident and multiple incidents. And I think the big area is attachment trauma that often goes under the radar, actually. There's almost like a hierarchy. You've got sexual abuse, then you've got physical abuse, then you've got emotional abuse, neglect, but that kind of deep attachment trauma where you're not responded to. So we kind of understand those categories, I think, often as professionals, and we train in them. But what the bit that's often missing for me is that in order to understand domestic abuse, you need to understand domestic abusers. And in order to understand sexual abuse, you need to understand sexual abusers, because we talk about them as homogenous groups of people, but they're not, because there's different types of violence, and there's different motivations for the different types of violence, and there's different types of sexual abuse and motivations. So that would be one thing that I would add, because if you're going in as a practitioner, a lot of the kind of inquiries into child deaths have come up with the thing that happened was a social worker went in and they were charmed by the abusive parent and they didn't talk to the child. And that to me is always a failure of not understanding that often abusers are very charming, lovely people, and they often do good things in the community. So there is something around understanding the profiles of people that do harm, not necessarily in a demonizing way, because often perpetrators are also victims, but that needs to kind of come into our understanding and our training.
Can I just add, Emma, you're on mute, but I just want to say, I think we need to expand some of our perpetrator programs and such as our behaviour change programs, etc., to be more trauma and violence informed. So thinking about factors within those interventions that address the trauma that's occurred in the perpetrators' lives as well.
I'm just going to kind of read out one of the last, the last question before we say goodbye. So Anita has said, I'm a family support worker working with children who have lived in families experiencing DV. We're currently looking at developing more sessions, working together with the survivor of DV and the children together, as well as the child individually. what advice can you give on the key things we need to bear in mind while developing these joint sessions? And from my perspective, just as a researcher and not as a practitioner, there are huge, I would say, before anyone pitches in, there are a number of resources around. So people have put in the chat about DART, which is an NSP PCC intervention. There's the AVA CODA intervention. There are lots of interventions, and what I see is a lot of reinventing of the wheel. So people going back to the drawing board and coming up with new session plans, when actually I think what we need to do is look at kind of what we've already got and what's appropriate. If it's not appropriate, to adapt it if there's any possibility, but to use what we've got rather than always directing resources to this, you know, development. And then we might be in a position to do a bit more evaluation of something that we've got and get a kind of deeper understanding of some of the responses. But that's just my perspective. Has anyone else got anything to pitch in with before we close?
My plea would be that with all interventions, be they already being used or in development, is that you engage in a very meaningful way with adult survivors of the intervention that you're trying to address, to give you their wisdom, which is where this project came from, and that's the distinctive of this project. We've got the Survivors Charter, which some of you may be aware of, which you can download from the Survivors Voices website, and it's basically saying that when you do any service development research projects that are around this field, that you need to put survivors central, and it gives you ways of doing that. So that would be my plea.
Thank you, and that's just a really lovely place to finish. Thank you to all our speakers. Thank you to the people that joined the webinar and who have pitched in with questions and chat. What's clear to me is there's real appetite to share ideas and to work together. We've had some requests about, I'm looking for work experience, how can I get involved in this and that. So we'll look at what we can do after this webinar to kind of capitalise on that that appetite for working together, so that we don't end up duplicating our efforts, and that actually we can forge some links between us. So you know, that would be my ambition from this. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a good rest of the day.